Zhukov. Greetings, Boris Mikhailovich. The situation in the southern sector is much more complicated than the General Staff had thought. This evening, developing the breach made by 3 or 4 of his infantry divisions, the enemy committed up to 2 panzer divisions and reached the line of Novi Suzy, 2 kilometers south of Pulkovo, Finskoye Koirovo, its northern outskirt, Konstantinovka, Gorelovo, Anino, Koporskoye, Ropsha, Gliadino, and is building up the offensive in a northerly direction. Krasnogvardeysk and the roads from Krasnogvardeysk to Pulkovo are also held by the enemy. The situation in this sector is therefore extremely serious. What makes matters worse is the absence of any reserves in the Leningrad area. We are resisting the enemy's offensive with whatever we can marshal: odd detachments, separate regiments, and newly activated workers' Opolchania divisions. Shaposhnikov. What measures have been taken? Zhukov. This evening we organized a system of artillery fire, including naval, anti-aircraft and other artillery, to shell the roads used by the enemy. We're taking stock of our mortars, and I think that by morning we'll manage to put up a dense barrage in the main sectors to back up our infantry along the line I have named. We are marshalling all aircraft of the Leningrad Front and the Baltic Fleet, along with approximately 100 tanks. In the southern outskirts of Leningrad, we are deploying the NKVD division along the Myaso-Kombinat Rybatskoye-Morskoye port line. So far, we have reinforced it with 100 guns and plan to give it at least another 100. That is all I can say so far about the situation in and around Leningrad. We are organizing a strike in the 8th Army sector to straddle the Kingisepp Highway and draw off part of the Nazi force from Leningrad with an attack against the enemy flank and rear. Then, cooperating with the 55th and 42nd Armies, we will eliminate the enemy in Krasnoye Selo. The 55th and 42nd Armies, we expect, will not go on the offensive until September 17th. No earlier date is possible because there is not enough strength. I hope to marshal strength by getting the Astanin group out. I hope to marshal some 5 divisions, that is, if we manage to get Astanin out of the encirclement in the next couple of days. If not, we'll have at least 3 divisions. I'll prepare a strike in cooperation with Kulik, but will not be able to mount it until we eliminate the enemy in Krasnoye Selo. Altogether, I have 268 aircraft on the Leningrad front, of which only 163 are in working order. We are badly short of bombers and attack planes. All we have is 6 P-2S, 2 IL-2S, 2 AR-12S, and 11 SBs. This is too little to accomplish what we have in mind. I appeal to the Stavka for at least 1 regiment of P-2S and another of IL-2S. Shaposhnikov. I think your plan of first organizing an artillery barrage is absolutely correct. The Leningrad front has enough guns to put up such a barrage. Zhukov. Splendid. Please bear in mind, however, that, as I have already said, the Krasnogvardeysk area up to the Izora River and all roads leading through Krasnogvardeysk to the north are held by the enemy. I am having to take urgent measures to restore order in the units. I think we'll have order within the next few days. If we have to, we'll not stick at anything. Please let Kulik have 2 or 3 more divisions so he can deliver a powerful blow. That will be the best possible help to our front in the prevailing situation. I am keeping in touch with Kulik by Bodo telegraph. Shaposhnikov. I take it that Krasnogvardeysk is blocking the road north, though the enemy bypassed it in the west. Now, of course, all attention should be centered on eliminating the Krasnoye Selo breach and then on cooperation with Kulik. I think that you will still find people and arms in your own backyard and in various higher educational establishments. The Stavka wants you to brief us on events at the front more often, both by wire and by radio. I will pass on your request for bombers to Comrade Stalin immediately. We had to pick the sector where to break the blockade. As we saw it, the enemy's MGA salient was the most suitable place. To begin with, it was no more than 15 to 20 kilometers wide. The terrain was wooded and swampy, with many large peat bogs. Small heights commanded a good view of the surrounding plain, and could be splendidly adapted for strong and effective defence, so that was where our eyes were turned for the most favourable place to break the blockade. Soon after my arrival in Leningrad, Shaposhnikov let me know that the Stavka was trying to relieve besieged Leningrad by having the 54th Army strike from the east. He asked me to assign troops for meeting attacks. Regrettably, the front had no troops to spare. Everything we had was concentrated in the main sector, and to borrow units from there was tantamount to surrendering the city. That is why we decided to assign just one division and a brigade of the Neva operational group to assist the 54th Army's advance. We had planned to strengthen this group by regrouping units and enhancing its firepower. The main front had recommended that the main effort be concentrated in the southeastern sector against the enemy's vital points. The day I arrived in Leningrad, I met with the commanders of our district and army headquarters to bring them up to date with the situation. I was impressed by their readiness to defend the city to the last. However, one thing was clear. We would have to use all forces we had to prevent the enemy from capturing the city. We assembled the commanders and the army headquarters at a meeting to evaluate the situation. Based on what we saw, we felt that if we acted decisively, we would break the siege. We recognized that the enemy was overextending himself in the siege. It was clear that the enemy, by concentrating his forces to the north and south of Leningrad, was trying to cut off our supply lines and isolate us from the outside world. Our plan to counter this would involve joint operations by the 42nd and 54th Armies. Once we had clarified our positions, we planned an urgent reconnaissance of the area to analyze enemy troop positions and gauge their strength. We were determined to deliver a powerful blow against the enemy and help relieve Leningrad from the south. We also saw this as an opportunity to strike a significant blow against the enemy and hasten the conclusion of the campaign. A sense of unity among the military leadership and the city's defenders was palpable as we prepared to execute our strategy. It was a matter of life and death for Leningrad, and we were fully committed to our mission. A fierce engagement was fought in the afternoon of September 13th in the vicinity of Gornoye Khandrovo, where we destroyed 28 panzers and a battalion of infantry. Still, the enemy is constantly active, especially today. That is all. It followed from what Kulik said that his army was not going on the offensive in the immediate future. This was distressing, because the situation in and around Leningrad was becoming critical. Apart from direct action by the 54th Army, I had also been counting on its air arm hitting important targets at the approaches to Leningrad. This I intended to bring home to Kulik. Zhukov. Thanks for the information, Grigory Ivanovich. I have a most insistent request. Don't wait for the enemy to attack. Organize a preliminary shelling at once, and take the offensive yourself in the general direction of Mga.Kulik. Certainly. I am thinking of the 16th or 17th. Zhukov. The 16th or 17th will be too late. We are dealing with a highly mobile enemy and must jump on him first. I'm sure that if you mount an offensive, you'll have good results. But if you don't begin tomorrow, please use all your aircraft to crush the enemy in the Podolovo-Kordelevo-Chernaya Rechka-Anolovo area. All these points are on the Izora River, 4 or 5 kilometers southeast of Slutsk. Raid the area all through the day, if only with a small number of planes, just to keep the enemy from raising his head. But that is an extreme measure. I beg you to attack and to send the cavalry into the enemy's rear, that's all. Kulik. I cannot mount the offensive tomorrow because the artillery hasn't yet arrived, and we haven't practiced joint action. Besides, not all units have come to the starting positions. I have just been informed that at 23 o'clock hours, the enemy mounted an attack in the Schlusselburg-Lipka-Sinyavino-Gontovaya-Lipka area. The attack has been repulsed. If the Nazis don't launch a general offensive tomorrow, I'll have my air force do what you asked. I knew all about the situation in and around Schlusselburg. Marshal Kulik was wrong. The enemy's action was nothing more than an attempt to test our defences in force. Kulik obviously did not, or did not want to, understand the desperately tense situation in Leningrad. I did not hide my annoyance any longer, and said, "The enemy did not mount an attack. He was merely reconnoitring in force. Unfortunately, some people mistake reconnaissance and skirmishes for an offensive. It is clear to me that you are above all worried about the welfare of the 54th Army, and evidently insufficiently worried about the situation in Leningrad. I want you to know that I am having to send people from the factories to meet the attacking enemy and have no time to practice joint action on site. I have understood that I cannot count on any active maneuver by your army. I will rely on myself only. Let me add that I am astonished at the lack of cooperation between your group and the front. It seems to me that Suvorov, if he were in your place, would have acted differently. Pardon me for speaking my mind, but I have no time for diplomacy. Best wishes. Despite all our measures, the situation in and around Leningrad continued to deteriorate. The enemy was becoming increasingly active. Field Marshal von Lieb was evidently doing his utmost to carry out Hitler's order and complete the Leningrad operation at any cost before the Germans launched their offensive on Moscow. In the morning of September 15th, the enemy renewed his attacks in the sector of the 42nd Army. 4 Nazi divisions backed by panzers and massive airstrikes were moving forward doggedly. At the price of considerable losses, they managed to push back our 10th and 11th Rifle divisions to the southern edge of Volodarsky and Uritsk. At other points, the 42nd managed to hold its ground. To prevent an enemy breakthrough to Leningrad at Uritsk, we reinforced the 42nd Army with the newly formed 21st Rifle Division of the NKVD, the 6th Opolchenia Division of People's Volunteers, and 2 rifle brigades consisting of seamen and the city's air defence personnel. These troops were ordered to man the outer perimeter of the city's fortified zone, running from the Gulf of Finland through Ligovo, Miasokombinat, and Rybatskoye to the Neva River. As a result, the 42nd Army had a strong second echelon, and its defences acquired tactical depth. This made the army's position much more dependable. By emerging on the outskirts of Volodarsky and Uritsk, the enemy had overextended his left flank even more, and we decided to take advantage of this and let our 8th Army counterattack. The commander of the 8th Army was ordered to leave cover troops in the Kernovo-Terentievo sector, to withdraw the 5th Marine Brigade to fortifications prepared earlier along the Kovashi River, and to concentrate the 191st and 281st Rifle Divisions and the 2nd Opolchenia Division on the left flank, hitting the enemy in the Lipitsy-Volodarsky area in the direction of Krasnoye Selo. The 10th and 11th Rifle Divisions and the 3rd Opolchenia Division of the 42nd Army, which were to participate in the counterattack, were turned over to the 8th Army, while its 125th and 268th Rifle Divisions were pulled back as the front's reserve. We thus formed an 8th Army task force to hit the enemy and, at the same time, restored the front reserve to parry any surprises. The developments proved that this was timely and correct. When reporting my decision to the Supreme Command, I did not hold back the contents of my conversation with Kulik. Stalin promised to speak to him. He did so in the evening of September 16th and demanded that he should not delay preparations for an offensive, but was to mount it resolutely and secure communications with Zhukov. In his conversation with you on September 15th, Stalin reminded Kulik, Zhukov described the situation of the Leningrad front to you, and that is why your operation must not be delayed. All the same, the offensive of the 54th Army did not begin until several days later. On September 17th, the fighting at the approaches to Leningrad attained its crescendo. On that day, 6 enemy divisions strongly supported by the Air Force of Army Group North mounted a new attempt to break through to Leningrad from the south. The city's defenders fought stoutly for literally every metre of soil and continuously counterattacked. The artillery of the Leningrad front and the guns of the Baltic Fleet rained shells upon the advancing enemy, while Army and Navy aircraft rendered all possible support to our ground forces. The military council of our front assessed the situation as exceedingly dangerous and issued a strict order to the military councils of the 42nd and 55th Armies, which read, "The Ligovo, Kiskino, Verkhneye, Koirovo, Pulkovo Heights, Moskovskaya, Slavyanka, Shushari, and Kolpino line is of exceptional importance for Leningrad's defence and may not be abandoned under any circumstances. And credit is due to our heroic fighting men. They appreciated the meaning of the order and obeyed it to the letter. Our troops put up a powerful artillery barrage, counterattacked continuously, and compelled the Nazis to go on the defensive. The 21st Rifle Division under Colonel I.D. Panchenko, the 6th Marine Brigade under Colonel D.A. Sinochkin, and the 7th Air Fighter Corps under Colonel N.D. Antonov distinguished themselves in repulsing an enemy strike through Ligovo at Leningrad. The gunners of the 42nd Army displayed courage beyond compare. Time and again, entire artillery battalions, sometimes even regiments, took up combat positions in the open and fired on the attacking enemy at point-blank range, wreaking destruction. In just the Ligovo-Pulkovo sector, more than 500 artillery pieces were thus positioned for direct laying. The 8th Army's counterattack played an exceedingly important part in frustrating the enemy's plan of breaking into Leningrad through Uritsk. Its shock force of 4 rifle divisions mounted an offensive in the general direction of Krasnoye Selo in the morning of September 19th. Though the attack failed to restore our defence line here, it compelled the Germans to take part of the forces from the most dangerous Uritsk-Leningrad sector and move them to the Peterhof sector, as we had wanted them to do. While continuing his ferocious attacks on the Pulkovo heights, the enemy also looked for weak spots in our defences in other sectors. In the morning of September 18th, he struck at the junction between the 42nd and 55th Armies and, on seizing the town of Pushkin, tried to envelop the Pulkovo heights from the left and Kolpino from the right, and thereby break through to Leningrad. But here, too, the Nazi troops failed to squash the resistance of the undermanned but heroic Soviet troops. At the height of the fighting for Pulkovo and Pushkino, the enemy delivered one of the most powerful artillery and air blows on Leningrad, trying thereby to break the will of the Leningraders and of the city's defenders. On September 19th, the shelling of the city lasted without interruption for 18 hours, from 1:05 hours to 19 o'clock hours. During this period, the German Air Force mounted 6 large raids on the city, with as many as 276 bombers breaking through to Leningrad. To suppress or destroy our powerful naval artillery, which was bombarding the advancing troops of Army Group North with annihilating effect, the Nazis mounted a series of massive raids on our warships and on Kronstadt on September 21st, 22 and 23. Several hundred bombers at once took part in these raids, but the intensive anti-aircraft fire and resolute attacks by Soviet fighter planes frustrated the enemy's designs. No substantial damage was done to the Baltic Fleet. Between September 23rd and 26, inclusive, the enemy made repeated attempts to seize the Pulkovo Heights, Peterhof, and Oranienbaum. But strong artillery, mortar, machine gun, and rifle fire, as well as airstrikes, repulsed the enemy attacks. At the same time, our infantry struck the enemy painfully again and again. To buttress defences in the area of Uritsk and the Pulkovo Heights, we summoned the reserves of the 23rd Army stationed on the Karelian Isthmus. The situation there was calmer. There was some sporadic firing by the Finns, with our troops responding in the same coin. This enabled us to take the Army's reserves and even a few regiments of some of the rifle divisions. A landing party of Marines was sent into the enemy rear in the Peterhof area to help out the Maritime Army Group. The seamen were not simply brave, but also fearlessly bold. Though the enemy had somehow spotted them and opened fire while they were still seaborne, they did not flinch. As they scrambled ashore, the Germans turned tail. By that time they had a more than healthy respect for our Marines, whom they called der Schwarze Tod, Black Death. Carried away by their initial success, the Marines pursued the fleeing enemy, but at dawn were themselves cut off from the sea. They fought gallantly, and most of them laid down their lives. Their commander, Colonel Andrei Vorozhilov, did not return from the raid either. Commandos of seamen and border guards of the 20th NKVD Division under Colonel A.P. Ivanov were sent behind enemy lines time and again, and everywhere they fought with prowess and valour. The rifle brigades formed of Baltic Fleet seamen distinguished themselves too in the September fighting. On September 20th, the Supreme Command again called on Marshal Kulik, commander of the 54th Army, to expedite his offensive. In his telegram to Kulik, Stalin insisted on immediate action. In these 2 days, the 21st and the 22nd, the Supreme Commander said in a telegram, a breach must be knocked into the enemy front, "Your troops must join the Leningraders. You have delayed long enough. Now you must make up for lost time. If you do not, the Germans will turn every village into a fortress, and you will never be able to join the Leningraders." But these instructions, too, were not carried out. So, on September 29th, Marshal Kulik was relieved of his command, and the Stavka placed the 54th Army under the Leningrad front. General Kozin was put in charge of the 54th without relieving him of his duties as the front's chief of staff. As we later learned, the Hitlerites, too, were urging von Lieb to hurry. Army Group North was told to lose no more time and crush the resistance of Leningrad's defenders to join hands with the Finnish troops in Karelia. Despite all of von Lieb's measures, his blandishments, exhortations, and even threats, the Nazi troops failed in their undertaking. Thanks to the highly active and dogged defence and the mass heroism displayed by our officers and men, the Nazi breakthrough to Leningrad by way of Krasnoye Selo, Uritsk, Slutsk, and Pushkin collapsed. Hitler was furious. He knew that time was working for the Soviet Union, not Germany. Overcoming immense difficulties, the Soviet Union was rallying the people, activating new armies, and massing powerful new resources. The summer and autumn campaigns of the Nazis registered no substantial strategic success. Yet winter was drawing near, and the Nazi armies were unprepared for it. In early October, our scouts reported that the Germans were building dugouts, fitting out bunkers and pillboxes for the winter, and laying mines and other obstacles to protect their battle lines. Our intelligence concluded that the enemy was preparing for the winter. For the first time in many days, we could tangibly feel that the front had fulfilled its mission and had halted the Nazi offensive on Leningrad. The defence lines at the southern approaches to Leningrad were now more solid and suffered no substantial change until January 1943. By that time, the positions of the two sides on the Svir River had solidified as well. So what were the main results and peculiarities of the defensive stage of the Leningrad battle in the autumn of 1941? And what were the reasons for the collapse of the Nazi offensive? The politico-military importance of the successful defence of Leningrad was that it had botched the far-reaching designs of the Nazi command. The tenacity and bold actions of the armies of the Leningrad front and of the Baltic fleet wore out the enemy, bled him badly, and pinned him down in the northern part of Russia, thus denying Hitler the chance of shifting the mobile 4th Panzer Group to the Moscow area in time to be effective. When Operation Typhoon was launched, the 4th Panzer Group had not yet recovered, and was sent into the Battle of Moscow in a depleted, weakened condition. This substantially contributed to the successful defence of Moscow and the crushing defeat of the enemy at the approaches to the Soviet capital. In September 1941, the situation in the Leningrad area was exceedingly complicated and changeable. The enemy engaged considerable panzer, motorized, and air forces, and compelled the Soviet command to react swiftly and audaciously to the fluid situation, improving its methods of warfare and troop control. The September fighting at Leningrad was exceedingly tense and bitter. The enemy's strength was being worn down while the resistance of the Soviet troops grew continuously stronger. Accordingly, the enemy's advance lost pace. In July, he had advanced an average of 5 kilometers daily, whereas in September it was no more than 1 or 2 kilometers, and this only in some sectors. Thanks to the measures of the Front Command, a dependable, deeply echeloned and insurmountable line of defence had been put up at the northern, southern and southeastern approaches to Leningrad by the end of September. Suffice it to say that when we stabilised the situation on the Leningrad front, our defences in the main sectors were of 2 lines. A rifle division with plenty of anti-tank weapons held a line of no more than 10 to 12 kilometres. Our defence had become invulnerable because we had put up a ramified system of fortifications, and because army and naval artillery was being put to good use. Important, too, was the effective cooperation between ground troops and the Air Force, as well as the dense, well-organised air defence of the city and the troops. The victory in the defensive battles at the close approaches to Leningrad was attained by the joint effort of all arms of the service, which relied on the heroic assistance of the city's inhabitants. The common effort was spurred by the splendid morale of the Soviet troops, by their unbending faith in victory, their profound patriotism, and hatred of the fascist invaders. The mass heroism and courage, the dedication in labour and battle shown by the defenders of Leningrad is unexampled in the history of wars. Enormous credit for this goes to the Leningrad city and regional party organizations for their skilled and efficient organizational work and the prestige they enjoyed among the city's inhabitants and the troops. 10 volunteer Opolchenia divisions were formed in Leningrad in the first 3 months of the war, as well as 16 separate artillery and machine gun Opolchenia battalions. In addition, dozens of workers' detachments were activated to reinforce the Opolchenia units, not counting the many local anti-aircraft defence squads. Tens of thousands of medical nurses were trained, and a large number of hospitals were fitted out for the army. Other important measures were taken too, to back up the fighting forces and assist the population. In addition to Opolchenia units, the Leningrad Regional and City Party committees, acting on the instructions of the Communist Party's Central Committee, formed some 400 partisan groups in 1941, totaling at least 14,000 effectives. These groups were sent to the Pskov, Godov, Narva, Luga, and other areas. More than 12,000 communists, the best of the best, responded to the party's call and joined the troops of the Leningrad front. 10,000 became political workers. They inspired their mates by word and deed to do their duty to the country fearlessly. Neither the heavy casualties nor the continuous, highly tense fighting could break the spirit of the city's valorous defenders. Leningraders, soldiers, and seamen preferred to die rather than surrender the city. It is hard to exaggerate the courage of the workers of Leningrad. They laboured with extraordinary dedication, going without food and sleep under shelling and bombing. Considerable damage was done to the Kirov plant, the Izorsky plant, the Russky diesel plant, the Bolshevik factory, the meat-packing plant, the Dubrovskaya power station, the Admiralty shipyards, the 1st of May factory, and other large enterprises. But despite the barbaric assault of the Nazi troops, the Leningrad workers did not leave their workplaces. Between July 1941 and the end of the year, they produced 713 tanks, 480 armoured vehicles, 58 armoured trains, more than 3,000 regimental and anti-tank guns, nearly 10,000 mortars, over 3 million shells and mines, and more than 80,000 rocket projectiles and bombs. The munitions output increased tenfold in the latter half of 1941, compared with the first 6 months of the year. Remarkably, a large portion of what Leningrad produced in October-December 1941 was flown out by air to our troops defending Moscow. In the last 3 months of 1941 alone, that is, at the very height of the Battle of Moscow, Leningraders sent the defenders of the capital more than 1,000 regimental guns and mortars. At that time, I was in command of the Western Front, fighting at the approaches to Moscow. I still remember how thrilled I was to learn of the help which Leningraders, those high-spirited men and women of great willpower who had already experienced hunger and privations, were rendering our front. Before the war, Leningrad had a population of 3,103,000, 3,385,000 counting the suburbs. As many as 1,743,129, including 414,148 children, were evacuated by decision of the Council of People's Commissars between June 29, 1941 and March 31, 1943. Control over the fulfillment of the governmental decision was entrusted to A.N. Kosygin. Despite the hardships of the evacuation and the immense difficulty of transplanting vast numbers of people and huge amounts of equipment to the Volga area, the Urals, Siberia, Kazakhstan, and other parts of the country, the job was done in good time. Credit for this is due to the clever organizational work of Kosygin and those others whom the party's Central Committee entrusted with what I should say was an exceedingly important mission. The party's Central Committee marshalled all resources and manpower to help the people of Leningrad. Cars and horses were used, along with all other possible modes of transport, to deliver food, ammunition, clothing, and medical supplies across the ice of Lake Ladoga. Lieutenant General D.V. Pavlov earned all possible praise for delivering food to Leningraders and troops in a complicated situation. Entrusted with this job by the State Defense Committee, he displayed great energy and inventiveness to supply the troops and to bring relief to the starving populace. As for me, I consider it a great honor that in the darkest hour I was entrusted with commanding the troops that defended Leningrad. Organizing the struggle in a beleaguered city against an enemy considerably superior in numbers and arms yielded many lessons that proved useful in all my later activity as Commander of Fronts and Deputy Supreme Commander. September 1941 impregnated itself in my memory for life. At the end of 1942, the situation on the Leningrad front was as follows. At the north and south of Lake Ladoga, the enemy was on the defensive, with some local initiative and offensive actions of his own. In early 1942, the 54th Army engaged in a successful defensive battle in the southern sector of the Leningrad front, with help from the newly formed Second Shock Army. However, from late winter and spring of 1942, enemy positions stiffened. Consequently, by May 1942, the German command decided to carry out new operations, placing particular emphasis on the attack against the southern sector of the Leningrad front. In the spring of 1942, the Leningrad front was commanded by General Ella Govorov. The enemy sought to isolate Leningrad completely and destroy the Soviet forces west of the city. In order to accomplish this, the Nazis made the most serious offensive to date on the Leningrad front. From May 1942 onward, the German command conducted active reconnaissance, sabotaging Soviet supply lines and gradually preparing for a summer offensive. The offensive, launched on July 15th, was one of the largest in the history of the war, involving considerable forces and means. The enemy concentrated 3 Panzer Corps, 2 motorized divisions, and a mass of infantry supported by artillery, air, and air landing troops. With the new attack, the enemy aimed to capture Leningrad and cut off the Leningrad front from the Soviet forces in the south. The front's defensive preparations took into account the lessons of previous battles. Soviet troops established new fortifications and improved their troop deployment. The defense consisted of a well-delineated system of fortified areas, allowing commanders to exercise more control and allowing units to regroup in case of a breakthrough. Despite the strength of the enemy's attack and its initial success, the defenders managed to halt the German advance in critical sectors. Soviet troops displayed remarkable courage and tenacity, and the front held strong under relentless pressure. The battle developed into a series of fierce engagements, with the defenders resolutely countering enemy maneuvers. Throughout July and August, the fighting remained intense, with the enemy attempting to break through at key points but failing to exploit their gains. Soviet forces utilized reserves effectively and successfully managed to stabilize the situation. The German command was disheartened by the failure of their offensive and began to lose confidence. By September 1942, the situation had shifted significantly. Soviet forces had regrouped, received reinforcements, and were prepared to launch a counteroffensive. The Leningrad front stood resilient, having absorbed the enemy's blows while also gathering strength for their own initiatives. The successful defense of Leningrad not only preserved the city, but also contributed significantly to the overall strategy of the Red Army in the Great Patriotic War. It became a symbol of resistance and determination against fascism, representing the courage of the Soviet people and their commitment to defend their homeland against a formidable adversary. Especially strong were the defences along the left bank of the Neva. Solidly dug in, the Nazis had before them a wide-open surface of water up to 800 metres in width. Even though frozen, the river was still an exceedingly difficult obstacle because there was no cover at all on the ice. The enemy's visual command of it was complete, and he had every inch under fire from the steep bank 5 to 12 metres high at the point of the projected breakthrough. The Germans had consolidated this natural obstacle with a dense network of barbed wire barriers and minefields. In view of these fortifications, the breakthrough would call for an immense effort, great skill, and selfless bravery. Though the Leningrad and Volkhov front commands had submitted their operational plans, which had been closely examined by the General Staff and approved by the Stavka well in advance, Supreme Commander Stalin, aware of previous setbacks, was worried about the outcome of Operation Iskra. Throughout December 1942, the fronts had painstakingly prepared for the offensive. The preparations were completed on January 1, 1943, the day fixed by the Stavka. But owing to the highly unfavourable weather, the warm weather had dragged on, and the ice on the Neva was not strong enough, while the swamps were still barely passable. It was dangerous to begin the operation. At the end of December, the commanders of the two fronts asked the Stavka to postpone the jump-off until January 10th, 12, and their request was granted. Early in January 1943, Stalin called me by phone at the headquarters of the Voronezh front, where I had gone to help prepare the Ostrogozhsk-Rossosh offensive. He came straight to the point. Voroshilov is in Leningrad as Stavka representative. The State Defense Committee thinks you too should go there. See at first hand if everything has been done for Operation Iskra to succeed. You still have time, so stop over in Moscow. There is something we must discuss with you. Since the operation at Ostrogozhsk and Rossosh was also a most important element in the Stavka's strategic plan, I asked what I should do with the preparations for the offensive of the Voronezh front. "What do you suggest?" Stalin parried. "Vasilevsky is in the swim, so let him complete the Voronezh job and let Voronov complete the job in the Stalingrad area. Settled. Take off for Moscow at once." In Stalin's office, I met A.I. Shakurin, People's Commissar of the aviation industry, and a group of aircraft designers. They were evidently ending a discussion of further improvements in the design of certain planes and of increasing the production of bombers. Obviously, things were going well in this field, for Stalin was in high spirits. "You may go," he said, putting an end to the discussion. "Go and make things hum." When the door closed behind them, Stalin said approvingly, "That's the sort of men the party has reared." He turned to me and said there was still some time before Operation Iskra, and he wanted me to visit the Third Shock Army for a couple of days. It was wrestling with the enemy group surrounded in the Velikiye Luki Novosokolniki Porechia area. "See how things are organized there," Stalin said. I said I would fly there that day. I mention this because the operation at Velikiye Luki and the adjoining region was important for the breakthrough at Leningrad. The advancing Soviet troops there were drawing off considerable enemy forces from the Leningrad theatre, and were thus contributing to the success of Operation Iskra. As Deputy Supreme Commander, I was constantly briefed by the General Staff on the situation in all sectors, and knew the Velikiye Luki operation thoroughly. On the spot, I examined the actions of the 8th Estonian Corps, which was then under the command of a most experienced and energetic Estonian, Major General L.A. Pern. Then I visited the 5th Guards Corps under General of the Army A.P. Beloborodov, one of our most prominent and hard-working military leaders, who is now twice hero of the Soviet Union. Alexander Kronik, who had been Sergeant Major in the squadron I had commanded in 1922, was in command of the 357th Rifle Division. It was a pleasure meeting an old buddy, but I was doubly pleased after I had acquainted myself in detail with the showing of his division, for it was faultless. The Third Shock Army was doing well. Its commanding officer, General K.N. Galitsky, and member of the Military Council, A.I. Litvinov, made a good impression on me. I told Stalin as much and left for the Volkhov front with his blessings in the early hours of January 9th. We Stavka representatives did not often get the chance of travelling by rail. Usually we flew in all haste to assigned theatres of operations. So when I found myself in a comfortable, warm railway compartment, I left orders not to disturb me and went to bed. This was my last opportunity to rest up before the job at hand, which would begin the moment I arrived. I was awakened by the train's suddenly losing speed. It was dark outside, not a light anywhere. It was close to 2 a.m. I got up quickly and dressed. The train stopped. The duty general came to the door of my compartment and announced that comrades Voroshilov and Zhdanov had come from Leningrad and were expecting me in their car. I went there instantly. The commanders of the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts and members of their military councils were gathered in Voroshilov's railway car. Voroshilov and Zhdanov greeted me warmly. "Stalin called and said you were coming," Voroshilov said. I replied that I was ready to take up my duties at once. We discussed various aspects of Operation Iskra without further delay. As always, we started by defining the objectives, then examined the plan of the coming action. The Stavka had issued directives to the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts on December 8, 1942, ordering them to crush the Nazi group in the Lipka-Gaitolovo-Moskovskaya-Dubrovka-Schlusselburg area and breach the blockade there. The plan was simple. 2 shock groups, one of the Volkhov and the other of the Leningrad front, would hit out in converging directions towards Robochi Pozyolok No. 5 kilometers north of Sinyavino, and split the enemy's defense line in the Schlusselburg-Manga salient. Auxiliary strikes were planned in other sectors, north and south of the main blow, so as to deny the enemy any chance of moving his manpower and weaponry. Let me confess that I was thrilled to see familiar place names reminding me of September 1941 on our operational maps. Moskovskaya Dubrovka. Here our men were still heroically clinging to a bridgehead, a tiny strip of land retaken in the first months of the blockade. Now, however, one of the auxiliary strikes to be delivered by the Leningrad front would cross that strip. Changes had occurred in other sectors. Not just a division was now advancing from Leningrad, as was the case in 1941, but a whole army, the 67th, under General M.P. Dukhanov. It included a number of divisions that had distinguished themselves in previous battles. General N.P. Simonyak's 136th, which had once defended Hanko Peninsula, General A. Krasnov's 45th Guards Division, and Colonel V.A. Trubachev's 86th. The artillery and aviation of the Baltic Fleet, S.D. Rybalchenko's 13th Air Army, and units of the Ladoga Flotilla's artillery were also committed in the operation. General V.Z. Romanovsky's 2nd Shock Army was assigned the chief mission on the Volkhov front, while elements of General F.N. Starikov's 8th Army were to advance in an auxiliary direction south of Gaitolovo. That's where I would work 2 days before the operation, since Voroshilov was going back to Leningrad to coordinate the actions of Leningrad front troops. The operation of the Volkhov front would be supported from the air by General I.P. Zhuravlyov's 14th Air Army. Reviewing the operational plans, we decided to make a few alterations, especially concerning the artillery offensive. When our conference was over, Voroshilov, Govorov and Zhdanov left for Leningrad, while I got down to work on the spot. I had a talk with K.A. Meretskov, commander of the Volkhov front, L.Z. Meklis, member of the Military Council, General M.N. Sharokin, Chief of Staff, and General G.E. Degtyaryov, who was in command of the front's artillery. I met the commanders of the armies. To begin with, I examined their blueprint of the operation. Then I looked into the logistics and made a detailed study of the plan of the coming battle with the commander of the 128th Rifle Division, General F.N. Parkhomenko, who would operate on the right flank of the main effort. I ended each day of my stay on the Volkhov front with a detailed situation. On January 12th, Operation Iskra started. The defenders had opened their hearts to the fighters of the Red Army, and casting off fear of the steel and fire, rushed forth, each of them ready to give their last drop of blood for the sake of victory over the enemy. The atmosphere in the assembly area was tense but filled with optimism. The feeling of solidarity with the common cause of liberating Leningrad had united the men, and it was evident that, despite the inclement weather, a full, crushing blow was ready. The troops received orders for the assault from the commanders of the fronts. The offensive began early in the morning, and the feeling of jubilation surged in my breast as the first artillery salvo echoed across the snow-covered expanse. The group was supported by powerful gun and mortar shelling. In the early morning of January 17th, the group under Senior Lieutenant Kosarev went over the top. The enemy kept the place under constant fire, but our men managed to tow the panzer home. They even brought its log, which they found in the snow nearby. The vehicle turned out to be of unusual design. We discovered that it was the first experimental specimen of a new heavy panzer called Tiger, which the Nazi command was testing on the Volkov front. It was subjected to a thorough examination, and experiments revealed its most vulnerable points. The results were circulated among all Soviet troops. That is why our tankmen and gunners did not falter when the Germans first used Tigers en masse in the Stalingrad and Kursk battles. The lifting of the Leningrad siege was a turning point in the historical battle for Leningrad. Overland communications linking the city with the rest of the country were restored, greatly improving the situation for the Leningraders, the army and the navy. Our victory eliminated the threat of German and Finnish troops joining in the region of Leningrad once and for all. The Nazi plan to starve the city's defenders to death was thwarted, causing irreparable damage to Nazi Germany's prestige. The operation of the Leningrad and Volkov fronts demonstrated the increased military skill of the Red Army and its command. For the first time in the history of modern wars, the besieger who had blockaded a large city for a long time was routed by a simultaneous strike from both outside and inside the beleaguered region. The offensive had been skillfully prepared by the Stavka and was successfully carried out. The Soviet victory at Leningrad in January 1943 was persuasive evidence that the country's war economy was on the rise. The shock groups of the Leningrad and Volkov fronts, the 67th and 2nd Shock Armies, had more than 4,000 guns and mortars. Between January and March 1943, troops of the Leningrad front alone used up nearly 3,000 freight cars of ammunition. The fact that the Leningraders, who had been blockaded for more than a year, managed to produce so much ammunition for the troops demonstrated that the enemy had failed to dampen the fighting spirit of the city's inhabitants or paralyze the work of its industries. The breakthrough spoke of the great moral and political unity of Soviet society and the friendship among the many peoples of the Soviet Union. Members of all Soviet nationalities fought at Leningrad, displaying unparalleled courage and mass heroism. About 22,000 officers and men of the Leningrad and Volkov fronts, the Baltic Fleet, and the city's Air Defense Army were decorated with orders and medals, and those who distinguished themselves the most were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Acclaiming the mass heroism of the Soviet fighting men in defensive battles and in the operation that broke the blockade, I, as a participant in the battle, cannot ignore the following fact. A fairly thick book by Harrison Salisbury, The 900 Days, The Siege of Leningrad, appeared in Britain in 1969. On the face of it, it is a thorough piece of work, with facts and figures given with references to sources, the list of which occupies 14 pages of small type. The nearly 500 items listed in the bibliography include 230 books by Soviet authors and 192 references to articles in our periodical press. A closer acquaintance with the book, however, reveals it to be partial and prejudiced. Its anti-Soviet tenor is obvious. The author picked out and described the most somber, painful and negative facts and episodes. One gets the impression that the sacrifices of the Leningraders and the troops of the Leningrad front for the sake of victory had been senseless and unnecessary. In effect, the book says little or nothing of the victory, nor does it mention the impact that the heroic 900-day defense of Lenin's city made on the course of the war in general. Mr. Salisbury presents well-known facts borrowed from published Soviet sources to the Western reader with the air of a discoverer. As a result, the uninformed may get the impression that he is the first to describe the suffering caused by the blockade, or to name the number of dead, etc. Mr. Salisbury discusses casualties with extraordinary lack of integrity. For example, he claims that the Soviet leadership is deliberately minimizing the number of those who died of starvation. Here, he is willfully misleading his readers. We have never withheld the number of victims of Nazi crimes, nor will we ever forget them. Right after the war, it was indeed difficult to count all the casualties. During that terrible winter of 1941-1940 seconds, there simply wasn't anyone to register those who died of hunger. However, the extraordinary State Commission for establishing and investigating the misdeeds of the Nazi invaders later determined that nearly 642,000 people had died of hunger during the blockade of Leningrad, and about 21,000 were killed in Nazi air raids and artillery bombardments. So, where is Mr. Salisbury's discovery? Is it not obvious that his glib talk about falsified and true losses in Leningrad is of little worth? Writers, Salisbury included, cannot alter the facts of history. The grandeur of the Leningraders' exploit reflects the lofty Soviet code of morals, the courage, endurance, and tenacity of the Soviet people, their fidelity to the ideals of socialism, and the superiority of our warcraft over that of Hitler's Wehrmacht. Those who do not acknowledge this axiom will never understand nor be able to explain the course of the Second World War as a whole, or the key historical battles, such as that for Leningrad. Much has been written about the heroic defence of Leningrad. Still, it seems to me that much more should be said about it and about all the other Soviet hero cities. It would be a good idea to publish a special series of epic books, richly illustrated and beautifully produced, containing strictly documentary material written up sincerely and truthfully. I believe every Soviet citizen would find a good place for such a book on their bookshelf. Let our young people know about the shot-up streets and lanes of the past war, the fire-blackened ruins, and the upturned land from which Soviet men and women, their grandfathers, fathers, and mothers, expelled the savage enemy. Let them see it all behind the new housing developments, the squares, and the avenues of present-day Soviet cities. This should be done while the witnesses and veterans of those heroic times are still alive. Though it is right that the signs of war and destruction should be removed as quickly as possible from the face of the earth so as not to distress the living, it is equally right that the image and spirit of those heroic war days should be passed down to succeeding generations. Ustinya Zhukova, the Marshal's mother in the 1930s. NCO Georgy Zhukov, 1916. Old Moscow, the First Mounted Army, 1920. Parade on Red Square, a military parade. Joseph Stalin, Cavalry Commander's Refresher Course, 1924-25. Front row, right to left. First, I.K. Bagramyan. Third, A.I. Yeremenko. Fifth, Chief of the Refresher Course Corps Commander M.A. Batorsky. Second row, right to left. First, Georgy Zhukov. Fifth, K.K. Rokossovsky. S.K. Timoshenko, People's Commissar for Defense, and Georgy Zhukov, commander of the Kiev Military District, at field exercises in 1940. General of the Army Georgy Zhukov, commander of the Kiev Military District during field exercises. The Drang nach Osten, panzers under fire, air defences in Moscow. This is how the Germans marched through Moscow, the battle for Stalingrad, street fighting in Berlin, Marshal G.K. Zhukov, General N.A. Berzarin, and Arthur Peake beside the Reichstag, the 3rd of May 1945. The commanders-in-chief of the Allied troops, left to right. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Marshal G.K. Zhukov, and General Delattre de Tassigny. Georgy Zhukov with his daughters, right to left, Ella, Era, and Masha. Georgy Zhukov and his wife Galina on holiday near Moscow. On October 5, 1941, I received a message from General Headquarters. Stalin wants to speak with the front commander over direct line. From the communications room of Leningrad Front HQ, I telegraphed to General Headquarters over the Bordeaux. Zhukov here. General Headquarters replied, "Stand by." In less than 2 minutes, the other end of the line telegraphed, "Stalin here." Stalin, "How do you do?" Zhukov, "How do you do?" Stalin, "Comrade Zhukov, can you get on a plane and immediately come to Moscow? The Stavka would like to discuss with you the necessary measures to rectify the situation on the left wing of the reserve front in the vicinity of Yukhnov. Leave someone in your place. Kozin, perhaps." Zhukov, "May I fly out early in the morning of October 6th? Stalin, "Excellent. We'll expect you in Moscow tomorrow." However, certain important events in the sector of the 54th Army made it impossible for me to leave on the morning of the 6th. With permission from the Supreme Commander, the flight was postponed. In the evening of October 6th, Stalin again phoned me in Leningrad. Stalin: "How are things with you? What's new in enemy actions?" Zhukov: "German pressure has slackened. According to what prisoners say, German troops sustained heavy losses in September and are taking up defensive positions near Leningrad. Artillery is shelling the city, and it is being bombed from the air. Our aerial reconnaissance has detected large columns of motorized infantry and tanks moving southward from the Leningrad area, evidently in the direction of Moscow." Having reported the situation, I asked the Supreme Commander if his order for me to fly to Moscow still stood. Stalin: "Leave General Kozin or Fedyuninsky in your place," Stalin repeated, "and fly to Moscow." I bade farewell to the members of the Leningrad Front Military Council and left for Moscow. Since General Kozin had to be rushed to the 54th Army, I delegated temporary command of the Leningrad Front to General Fedyuninsky. In Moscow I was met by the chief of Stalin's bodyguard. From him I learned that the Supreme Commander was ill and was working at home. We went there at once. Stalin had a cold. He didn't look very well and received me curtly. He acknowledged my greeting with a nod and called my attention to a map where he pointed out the Vyazma area. Stalin: "Look at this," he said. "A very grave situation has developed. I can't get a detailed report from the Western and Reserve fronts on the true situation there, and we cannot make any decisions without knowing where and with what strength the enemy is mounting the offensive, or what the fighting value of our troops is. You are to go at once to Western Front headquarters to investigate the situation thoroughly. Phone me from there at any hour, day or night. I'll be waiting for your call." After a moment, Stalin asked, "What's your opinion? Do you think the Germans can soon mount an offensive against Leningrad?" "I don't think so. They suffered heavy losses and moved out tanks and motorized divisions all along the way from outside Leningrad to the central direction. Given the strength they have now, they are not in a position to mount a new offensive operation." "And where do you think they are going to send those tank and motorized forces that Hitler moved out of the Leningrad area?" "Obviously in the direction of Moscow, but only after they are brought up to full strength again and repairs are made to the equipment." Throughout our discussion, Stalin stood at the table on which there was a topographical map of the Western, Reserve and Bryansk fronts. Pointing to the Western Front, he said, "Apparently they've already been moving in that direction." I immediately went to see B.M. Shaposhnikov, Chief of General Staff, and gave him a detailed picture of the situation as of October 6th in the Leningrad area. "The Supreme Commander has just phoned," he said. "He ordered us to prepare a map of the Western sector for you. It will soon be ready. Western Front Command is where Reserve Front HQ was in August when you conducted operations to crush the enemy near Yelnya. Shaposhnikov filled me in on the details of the situation on the Moscow sector. He gave me the Supreme Command order, which stated, 'To the Commander of the Reserve Front, to the Commander of the Western Front. By order of the Supreme Command, General of the Army Zhukov is assigned to command the Reserve Front and represent the Stavka. The Stavka requests that Comrade Zhukov be informed of the situation. All decisions taken by Comrade Zhukov in the future regarding the utilization of the troops and on questions of conducting operations are to be heeded absolutely. Chief of General Staff Shaposhnikov. October 6, 1941, 1930 HRS." While we were waiting for the map, Shaposhnikov poured me a cup of strong tea. He said he was very tired and he looked it. I left Shaposhnikov and went straight to Western Front headquarters. On the way, I studied the situation on the map using a pocket flashlight. I was very sleepy, so every now and then I had the driver stop the car and I took short runs to shake off sleep. It was night when I reached Western Front HQ. The duty officer reported that the commanding officers were in conference with the front commander. The commander's office was dimly lit with stearin candles. Sitting at a table were Konev, Sokolovsky, Bulganin, and Malandin. Everyone looked exhausted. I told them I was there on the Supreme Commander's order to investigate the situation and phone in a report at once. What Lt. General Malandin, Chief of the Front HQ Operations Division, was able to tell me in reply to my questions about the latest developments supplemented and specified the information we already had. What had happened on the western sector? At the time the German troops started advancing on Moscow, 3 fronts were defending the far approaches to the capital. They were the Western, Commander General Konev, the Reserve, Commander Marshal Budeny, and the Bryansk, Commander General Yeremenko. In late September, the 3 fronts had a combined strength of about 1,250,000 men, 990 tanks, 7,600 mortars and guns, and 677 planes. Most of the troops, means and equipment were on the Western Front. After regrouping his troops on the Moscow sector, the enemy had a force superior to the combined strength of our 3 fronts. He had 40% more men, 70% more tanks, 80% more mortars and guns, and twice as many planes. The German offensive, codenamed Typhoon, began on September 30th with attacks by Guderian's tank group and the Second Army on the Bryansk front forces in the sector between Zhukovka and Shostka. On October 2nd, the enemy dealt powerful blows at the troops of the Western and Reserve fronts, hitting especially hard from areas north of Dukhovshchina and east of Roslavel. He succeeded in piercing our defences. The enemy shock units lunged forward from the south and the north, enveloping the Vyazma grouping of the Western and Reserve fronts. An extremely grave situation developed to the south of Bryansk, where the 3rd and 13th Armies of the Bryansk front found themselves faced with the threat of encirclement. Encountering no real opposition, Guderian's troops headed for Orel, where we did not have the forces to repulse the offensive. On orders of the Supreme Command, a reinforced 1st Guards Rifle Corps was formed under Major General Lelyushenko on October 2nd. Its mission was to hold up the enemy advance and enable the Bryansk front to withdraw its troops. On October 3rd, developing their offensive, the Guderian forces captured practically undefended Orel, with the Nazi 24th Motorized Corps emerging in the rear of the Bryansk front. The 1st Guards Rifle Corps, deployed in the Mutsensk area, engaged the enemy's motorized group and panzers. It held them at bay for several days, inflicting considerable casualties and destroying much of their weaponry. For the first time, the tankmen of our 4th and 11th Brigades hit enemy vehicles from ambush. The troops of the Bryansk front took advantage of the good show put up by the 1st Guards Rifle Corps to withdraw to the appointed line. Here are the recollections of the episode by General Guderian, commander of the Nazi 2nd Panzer Army. The 2nd of October, simultaneously in the operational zone of the 24th Panzer Corps near Mutsensk, northeast of Orel, bitter fighting broke out involving the 4th Panzer Division. A large number of Russian T-34S was engaged in the battle, causing considerable losses to our panzers. The superiority that our panzers had so far was now lost and seized by the adversary. This wiped out the chances of a rapid and uninterrupted success. He added, the planned swift offensive on Tula had to be put off. True enough. Not only had Guderian put off the offensive on Tula, he also never captured the city. But the Bryansk front was cut. Suffering losses, its troops were rolling back east, fighting all the way. A menacing situation took shape in the Tula sector. General Konev, commander of the Western Front, ordered a counteroffensive from the north of Vyazma against the enemy's northern grouping that was trying to outflank his troops. Unfortunately, that counteroffensive was not successful. Late on October 6th, a considerable part of the troops of the Western and Reserve fronts was encircled west of Vyazma. From my talks with the officers at Western Front headquarters and an analysis of the situation, I got the impression that the disaster in the area of Vyazma could have been averted. Despite the enemy's superiority in manpower and materiel, our troops could have avoided encirclement. To do so, it had been necessary to determine more exactly and in time the directions of the enemy's main effort and concentrate the bulk of the troops and weapons on those directions at the expense of the inactive defence sectors. However, this was not done, and our defences were not able to sustain the enemy's concentrated blows. Large gaps were made in our defence line, which we had nothing to close with. There were no reserves at the command's disposal. At 2:30 a.m. on October 8th, I phoned Stalin. He was still up and working. After outlining the situation on the Western Front, I said, "The main danger now lies in the weak Mozhaisk defense line. Because of this, enemy armoured troops may suddenly appear near Moscow. We must bring up forces quickly from every possible place to the Mozhaisk line." "Where are the 19th and 20th Armies and Boldin's group of the Western Front?" Stalin asked. "Where are the 24th and 32nd Armies of the Reserve Front?" "They've been encircled to the west and northwest of Vyazma," I replied. "What do you propose to do?" "I'm leaving at once for the Reserve Front to see Budeni." "Do you know where the Reserve Front's headquarters is?" "I'll look for it in the neighbourhood of Maloyaroslavets." "All right. Go to Budeni and call me from there." A steady drizzle was falling, and the thick fog clinging to the ground restricted visibility. When on the morning of October 8th we drove up to the Obolenskaya railway station, we saw two signalmen laying a cable from the bridge across the river Protva to Maloyaroslavets. "Where are you pushing these wires to, comrades?" I called out to them. "Right where we've been ordered to push them," one of them, a huge man, replied, without even looking up. I had to tell them who I was and that we were looking for Reserve Front HQ. The huge signalman stood at attention and said, "Excuse me, Comrade General, I did not know you by sight. That's why I answered the way I did. You've already passed headquarters. It was moved here 2 hours ago and is housed in the cottages over there in the forest on the hill. The sentries there will show you the way." The car turned around. Soon I was in the room of Army Commissar First Class L.Z. Mekhlis, a GHQ representative, who was with Major General A.F. Anisov, Chief of Staff of the Front. Mekhlis was on the phone, giving someone hell. I asked them where the commander was, and the Chief of Staff answered, "Nobody knows. He was with the 43rd Army during the day. I'm afraid that something unpleasant may have happened to Budeni." "Have you taken steps to find him?" "Yes, I've sent liaison officers, but they haven't come back yet." Mekhlis addressed a question to me then. "And what assignment brings you here?" he asked. "I've come as a Stavka member on the Supreme Commander's instructions to investigate the situation here. You can see that the situation is none too good. Right now I'm rounding up the stragglers. At assembly points we'll arm them and form new units out of them." My talks with Mekhlis and Anisov gave me very little concrete information about the situation of the Reserve Front troops or the enemy. So I got in the car and rode on to Yukhnov, hoping to quickly find out more on the spot. As we drove across the Protva River, I involuntarily recalled my childhood. I knew the area very well, as I had walked through it many times in my youth. My native village of Strelkovka was 10 kilometers away from Obninskoye, where Reserve Front HQ was located. My mother, my sister, and her 4 children were living in Strelkovka. "How are they? Suppose I call on them." But that was impossible. There wasn't time. I asked myself what would happen to them if the fascists came to the village. What would they do to a Red Army general's relatives? Shoot them, surely. First chance I get, I thought, I'll have them brought to Moscow. 2 weeks later, the Germans occupied Strelkovka, as well as all of the Ugodsky Zavod district. Luckily, I was able beforehand to send my mother, sister, and her children to Moscow. My fellow villagers did not sit around doing nothing. A guerrilla detachment was formed in the region with Viktor Karasev, a YCL member and former frontier guard, at the head. He was an exceptionally brave man and a clever organizer. His commissar was Alexander Kurbatov, secretary of the Ugodsky Zavod District Party Committee. The chairman of the Ugodsky Zavod District Executive Committee, M.A. Guryanov, whom I would describe as a dauntless people's avenger, was also in that detachment. The Ugodsky Zavod partisans made bold raids on enemy headquarters, logistical establishments, and small units. Unfortunately, in November 1941, the Germans took communist Guryanov prisoner. They beat him up brutally and hanged him. To this day, my fellow villagers tend this hero's grave with loving care. When the enemy retreated, he burnt down Strelkovka, along with several other villages. My mother's house went up in flames too. Among the other strong partisan units operating in the region was that commanded by V.V. Jarbo. This unit played a crucial role in all the operations against the 12th German Army Corps, which was preparing to move in the direction of Moscow. On November 29, 1941, Sovinform reported one of these operations. We have received information on the great success of the partisan units in the region. On November 24th, partisan units raided an important locality, meaning Ugodsky Zavod, G.J. They destroyed the enemy headquarters and seized important documents. Jarbo was born in Donetsk in 1909. As a border guard officer, he displayed great courage and gallantry. He was recommended to me as a conscientious and resolute commander. I received him personally and was impressed by his careful preparation of everything he did. As a native of the region where these units were operating, I knew well the terrain where the enemy forces were moving and was able to give advice as to how things could best be accomplished. The operation was successfully carried out. Vladimir Jarbo died a hero's death on August 8, 1943, in fighting near the village of Dubrovo, Kotinets district in the Orel region, where he was in command of the 49th Mechanized Brigade of the 6th Guards Mechanized Corps. The Ugodsky Zavod district was liberated by the 17th Rifle Division under General D.M. Seleznev. A town, Obninsk, was built after the war on the site of the village of Pyatkino, burnt down by retreating German troops, where, in 1941, the headquarters of the Reserve Front and later of the Western Front had been. The town of Obninsk is now known far and wide as the place where the world's first atomic power station was built. Today, Obninsk is a major scientific centre. But back to the events of that time. Once in Maloyaroslavets, we drove to the centre of the town without meeting a soul. The town looked abandoned. In front of the building of the District Executive Committee, I saw 2 cars. I shook the driver of one of them awake. "Whose cars are these?" I asked. "Marshal Budeni's, Comrade General? Where is he?" "Inside." "How long have you been here?" "About 3 hours." I entered the District Executive Committee building and saw Budeni poring over a map. We shook hands warmly. One could tell that he had gone through a lot in those difficult days. "Where are you from?" Budeni asked. "From Konev." "How are things with him? We've been out of touch for 2 days. While I was at the 43rd Army's headquarters yesterday, Front HQ moved. I don't know where to." "I've found it in a forest beyond the railway bridge across the Protva. They are waiting to hear from you. The bulk of our forces on the Western Front have been encircled." "We're no better off here," Budeni said. "The 24th and 32nd Armies have been cut off. Yesterday, I myself was nearly captured between Yukhnov and Vyazma. I saw large tank and motorized infantry columns moving in the direction of Vyazma. Evidently the enemy wants to encircle the town by a turning movement from the east. Who controls Yukhnov? I don't know now. There were up to 2 infantry regiments, but without any artillery, on the Ugra. I think Yukhnov is in the hands of the enemy. And who's covering the road from Yukhnov up to Maloyaroslavets? As I was riding here, all I met were 3 militiamen in Medin, no one else. The local government has left Medin. "Go to front headquarters now," I told Budeni. "See what's what there and inform General Headquarters of the situation. I'll go to the Yukhnov area. Report our meeting to the Supreme Commander, tell him I went to Kaluga. We've got to find out what's happening there." When I got to Medin, I found no one there. I saw only an old woman rummaging through the ruins of a house that had been turned into a pile of rubble by an aerial bomb. "What are you looking for, Granny?" I asked. She raised her head. Wide, wandering eyes stared at me vacantly. "What's the matter with you, Granny?" Without a word in reply, she went back to digging at the rubble. Another woman carrying a sack that was half full emerged from among the ruins. "Don't ask her. She's gone mad with grief. There was an air raid the day before yesterday. The Germans bombed and machine-gunned us. This woman lived in this house with her grandchildren. She was at the well getting a pail of water when a bomb hit the house right in front of her very eyes. The children were killed. Our house was also destroyed. I'd be off in a hurry, but I thought I'd look for some clothes and shoes under the wreckage." Tears streamed down her cheeks as she talked. With a heavy heart, I started again in the direction of Yuknov. Ever so often I had to stop and look around carefully so as not to drive into enemy-occupied territory. I had gone 10 or 12 kilometers when my car was suddenly stopped on a forest road by armed soldiers wearing overalls and tankmen's helmets. One of them came up to the car and said, "You can't go any farther! Who are you?" I told him and asked in turn where their unit was located. "Here in this forest," he replied. "Headquarters of our tank brigade is only 100 meters away." "Very well, take me to headquarters." I was glad that a tank brigade was here. A short man in neat blue overalls and tankman's goggles over his service cap rose to greet me. I thought I had seen him somewhere. "FHQ Reserve Tank Brigade Commander Colonel Troitsky reporting," he began. "Troitsky? What a surprise! I didn't expect to meet you here." I remembered Troitsky from the action on the Kalka River, Khalkhin Gol, where he was Chief of Staff of the 11th Tank Brigade, the brigade commanded by hero of the Soviet Union, MP Yakovlev. That brigade was the dread of the Japanese. "I didn't expect to meet you here either, Comrade General," said Troitsky. "I knew you were in command of the Leningrad front, but I didn't know you had left it." "Well, what's happening here? Let's hear it. First of all, where is the enemy?" "The enemy is about to capture Yuknov," Colonel Troitsky told me. "His advance units have crossed the bridge over the Ugra. I've sent out reconnaissance to Kaluga. Enemy troops have not yet entered the town, but bitter fighting is going on at the approaches. The 5th Rifle Division and several withdrawn units of the 43rd Army are in action there. The brigade under my command is part of the Supreme Command Reserve. This is the second day I've been here, and I have had no instructions. Send a liaison officer to Reserve Front Headquarters. It's located in the area of the Obninskoye railway station beyond the bridge across the Protva in the village of Pyatkino. Report the situation to Marshal Budeny. Deploy part of the brigade to protect the entire Medin direction. Through Reserve Front Headquarters, report the orders I've given you to the General Staff and tell them that I have gone on to Kaluga to the 5th Rifle Division. Later I learned that the bridge across the Ugra had been blown up by the detachment of Major I.G. Starchak, Chief of the Paradrop Service of the Western Front. This 400-strong detachment had been formed on October 4th on his own initiative and was made up of frontier guards trained for operation in the enemy rear. Having blown up the bridge, the detachment under Starchak took up a defensive position along the bank of the Ugra. Soon it was reinforced by a detachment of military school students from Podolsk under the command of Sr.Lieutenant L.A. Mamchik and Captain Y.S. Rosikov. The epic stand of these two detachments prevented the enemy from forcing the UGRA and breaking through to Medin. There were few men left alive after 5 days of bitter fighting, but that heroic self-sacrifice frustrated the enemy plans of an early seizure of Maloyaroslavets and enabled our troops to gain time and organize defenses at the approaches to Moscow. At the same time, students from the artillery and the machine gunners' schools in Podolsk arrived in the Maloyaroslavets area, where they took up positions to strengthen the sector. A liaison officer caught up with me in the neighborhood of Kaluga and handed over a message received by phone from the Chief of General Staff, which said that the Supreme Commander ordered me to report at Western Front Headquarters on October 10th. As October 8th drew to a close, I again left for Reserve Front Headquarters. I was met by the Chief of Staff of the front, who handed me the Supreme Command order removing Budeny and appointing me Commander of the Reserve Front. Immediately after that, I received orders requesting me to arrive at Western Front Headquarters on October 10th. I phoned Shaposhnikov, and in reply to my question as to which front to proceed to, he said, "The thing is that the State Defense Committee is examining the question of dissolving the Reserve Front and combining its forces with those of the Western Front. It is suggested that you assume command of the Western Front. Up to October 10th, you look after the situation on the Reserve Front and do what you can to ensure that the enemy does not advance along the Mozhaisk-Maloyaroslavets line, nor from the Alexin area on the Serpukhov sector." On October 10th, almost immediately after I arrived at Western Front headquarters located in Krasnovidovo, I was called to the phone. Stalin was on the line. The Supreme Command has decided to appoint you commander of the Western Front. Konev will be your deputy. Any objections? No. What objections can there be? I think Konev should be put in command of the forces on the Kalinin sector. That sector is far too isolated, and we've got to make it a secondary division of the front. Very well, Stalin agreed. The remaining units of the reserve front, the troops of the Mozhaisk defense line, are to come under your command. Assume control of the Western Front and act quickly. I've already signed the order, and it has been sent to the fronts. I'll act on your instructions right away, but I'm asking for larger reserves to be sent as soon as possible, since we may expect an intensification of the enemy thrust towards Moscow any time now. I soon received the order from General Headquarters. Directly to the Military Council of the Western Front, the Military Council of the Reserve Front, to Commander of the Reserve Front Comrade Zhukov, and to Comrades Molotov and Voroshilov, October 10th, 1941, 17 o'clock. In relation to the uniting of the commands of forces operating on the Western Sector, the Supreme Command orders 1. To unite the Western and Reserve Fronts in the Western Front. 2. To appoint Comrade Zhukov, Commander of the Western Front. 3. To appoint Comrade Konev, Deputy Commander of the Western Front. 4. To appoint Comrades Bulganin, Koklov and Kruglov, members of the Military Council of the Western Front. 5. Comrade Zhukov is to assume command of the Western Front as of 18 o'clock on October 11th, 1941. 6. The Reserve Front is to be dissolved and used to complement the Western and Moscow Reserve Fronts. Please acknowledge receipt. Stavka of the Supreme Command, J. Stalin, B. Shaposhnikov. I discussed the situation with Konev, and we decided that front headquarters should be moved to Alabino. Konev and a group of officers and the necessary control means were to go to the Kalinin sector to coordinate the actions of the body of troops there. The Military Council of the Front was to go to Mozhaisk to look into the situation on that sector and discuss it with Colonel S.I. Bogdanov, Commandant of the Mozhaisk fortified area. So the front staff began moving to Alabino, while Bulganin, a member of the Military Council, and I arrived in Mozhaisk a couple of hours later. From his office we could hear the sound of artillery fire and bomb explosions. Bogdanov told us that the 32nd Rifle Division, supported by artillery and tanks, was in action against the enemy's advance mechanized and armoured units at the approaches to Borodino. The division commander was Colonel Six Polosukin, a highly experienced man. The 32nd Rifle Division could be relied on. Giving Bogdanov the necessary instructions, we left for front headquarters, which was temporarily housed in camp cabins in Alabino. The staff immediately got down to organizational and operational matters. There was a great deal to be done. We had to quickly organize a solid defense system along the Volokolamsk-Mozhaisk-Maloyaroslavets-Kaluga line. We had to develop it in depth and also constitute second echelons and front reserves so we could move them to threatened areas, organize ground and air reconnaissance and effective control of the troops, and provide logistic support. The most important task was to step up party political work, to raise the morale of the troops and their confidence in their strength and inevitable victory over the enemy on the approaches to Moscow. Work in these directions was proceeding day and night. People were literally falling off their feet with fatigue, but motivated by a sense of responsibility for the destiny of Moscow and of their motherland, and following the directives of the Communist Party, they continued to extend the defences on the approaches to Moscow. In the summer and autumn of 1941, the Central Committee of the Party, the State Committee for Defence and the Supreme Command undertook several major measures to reinforce the Moscow defences, raise considerable manpower reserves, and replenish the army in the field with personnel and equipment. Extra measures were undertaken to stop the enemy. In the early hours of October 7th, the troops of the Supreme Command Reserve and the fronts adjacent to the Mozhaisk area were transferred to the Mozhaisk defence line. 14 rifle divisions, 16 armoured brigades, over 40 artillery regiments, and other units arrived. The 16th, 5th, 43rd and 49th Armies were being formed anew. By mid-October, they were 90,000 strong. Obviously, for an enduring and reliable defence, these forces were clearly insufficient. But the Supreme Command could not expend more troops at the time. Troop dispatchment from the Far East and other remote areas was delayed for a number of reasons. Therefore, we first and foremost decided to organise the Volokolamsk, Mozhaisk, Maloyaroslavets and Kaluga sectors, where we concentrated the main artillery and anti-tank forces. The 16th Army, whose staff and command personnel were headed by Rokossovsky, Lobachev and Malinin, was assigned to the Volokolamsk sector. The army comprised new elements since its divisions previously assigned to the 20th Army had been encircled west of Vyazma. The 5th Army under Maj. General Lelyushenko, after he was wounded he was replaced by General Govorov, concentrated on the Mozhaisk sector. The 33rd Army, which Lt. General Yefremov had been quickly assigned to command, was concentrated in the Naro-Fominsk area, the 43rd Army under Maj. General Golubev on the Maloyaroslavets sector, and the 49th Army under Lt. General Zakharkin on the Kaluga sector. They were all experienced military leaders and had our full confidence. We were sure that they, at the head of their troops, would do everything possible to stop the enemy advance on Moscow. Here I must mention the really excellent work of the staff of the front, with Lt. General Sokolovsky as chief and Lt. General Melandin as chief of operations, as well as the energetic efforts by Maj. General Psurtsev, signal troops commander, in providing adequate communications with the troops of the front. Extensive engineering and sapper work was being done in the rear of the first echelon units to develop the defence system in depth. Anti-tank defences had been built in all tank-threatened directions. Front reserves were being drawn to the likely directions of the main attack. Front HQ was soon moved from Alabino to Perkushkovo. Telephone and telegraph lines connected it with headquarters of the ground and air forces of the front, and with the Supreme Command's general headquarters. In this way, an actually new Western Front was organised. It was confronted with a truly historic task: the defence of Moscow. Led by its Central Committee, the party began extensive work to make the people aware of the grave situation that had developed, of the imminent danger looming over Moscow. The Central Committee called on the people to do their duty to the country with honour and to halt the enemy advance on Moscow. West and northwest of Vyazma, our troops continued to fight heroically behind enemy lines, trying to break out of encirclement and link up with the Red Army forces. But all their attempts were futile. The command of the front and the Supreme Command helped the surrounded troops by bombing the enemy battle formations and by airdropping provisions and ammunition. But this was all they could do, since they lacked both manpower and equipment. Having found themselves surrounded by the enemy, the troops did not lay down their arms, but continued to fight courageously. In this way, they pinned down the main forces of the enemy, and did not allow the offensive towards Moscow to gather momentum.